What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another Modern video, and today we're going to be taking a look at arguably one of the best decks to currently be playing in the Modern format as of the time of this recording, the Temur Rhinos / Crashing Footfalls deck for Modern. This list in particular coming from the Modern Challenge that went 9-1, good enough for first place in the event by Starchy. Of course, we had the regional championship in Europe, and I did want to go over that list, but I figured worth going into the Modern Challenge list because the casual spikes will be going over some of the results and kind of our thoughts and everything from that whole event. So I'm going to be saving it for that. So if you want to check it out and you want to see any more of my other videos on the Modern Pioneer format or longer form content, please consider subscribing and ring the notification bell so you know when those videos get posted. And if you go into the link in the description down below, you'll find a link to my Discord server. You can go follow that link, join over as well as the link to this deck list there. So Crashing Footfalls is, as I alluded to, or just flat out said, that it is probably the best deck to be playing in Modern currently. And the reason why is kind of crazy, because we talk about how aggressive decks aren't typically good in Modern and even in Pioneer as well, just with how the format's set up. Of course, we talked about it in depth also on the podcast as well. Just another plug there. So the Crashing Footfalls deck is, I guess I wouldn't necessarily call it an aggro deck, but it does win the game through attacking your opponent very early and often, with the help of the card Crashing Footfalls, which is the namesake of the deck. So it is a no-costed sorcery, but it's green because of the little stamp next to sorcery, just in case you didn't know that. It has Suspend 4 by paying a green, and rather than casting this card from your hand, you can pay a green and exile it with 4 time counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, remove a time counter. When the last time counter is removed, cast it without paying its mana cost, which has now technically been changed to you may cast it without paying its mana cost. So in that case, there was like a rule change where Suspend, you were forced to cast the spell. Now you may choose to cast it, and if you don't cast it, it just remains exiled. There is some case scenarios where it does come up, like if your opponent has a Roiling Vortex, you can choose not to cast your Crashing Footfalls, take 5 damage from the Vortex. Also like Eidolons and stuff like that. I mean, there's some scenarios that come up. I wouldn't say that it comes up so often where it's actually like a decision where you kind of rack your brain. It's kind of more of a, when this situation comes up, like you have to kind of evaluate the situation and figure out if taking 5 or taking 2 or whatever the scenario may be, or anything else is worth making 2 4/4 Rhinos with trample. In a lot of cases, you are going to be playing this, and it is going to make 2 4/4s with trample, which is the most annoying part of this card, is the fact that it has trample. So, like typical suspend card fashion, we are not going to wait 4 turns. We're not going to wait till turn 5 to get Rhinos, or turn 6 to get Rhinos. We're going to try to get them on turn 3. And we're going to do that through the help of, you guessed it, Shardless Agent, and we're going to do it with Violent Outburst. Now, of course, these are the typical Cascade cards. Cascade says whenever you play this spell, remove cards from the top of your library until you remove a non-land card that costs less. You may play without paying its mana cost. You put the remove cards on the bottom of the library in a random order. So you cast a spell. You do not play anything that costs 2 or less aside from the Crashing Footfalls in typical Suspend / Cascade fashion. And you're going to get 2 4/4s for your trouble. There is an element to this deck that is different from a lot of other Cascade decks. The other one being the Living End deck, where you just cycle a bunch of creatures that are overcosted, and you try to resolve one of your Cascade spells to then put a bunch of creatures into play, and hopefully it ends up being lethal, or lethal over like 2 turns at the most, at least to the point where your opponent can't really interact profitably with what's going on. To kind of continue on, this deck is more interactive typically than a lot of the other decks. So You have like Tishana's Tidebinder, and you have like Subtlety as ways to kind of interact with the board. Tishana's Tidebinder is new from the Lost Caverns of Ixalan set. As a 3-mana 3/2 with Flash, and when it enters the battlefield, you can counter up to one target activated or triggered ability. If it is an ability of an artifact, creature, or planeswalker that is countered this way, the permanent loses all abilities as long as Tishana's Tidebinder remains on the battlefield. This is important because like later in the game, this kind of gives you a way, although mana intensive, to play around a Chalice of the Void. Well, I guess it doesn't necessarily have to be mana intensive. So if you have like a Footfall suspended and your opponent goes Chalice on 0, you can cast the Footfalls. The Chalice trigger goes on the stack. You can Tishana's Tidebinder, counter the Chalice trigger, and then the Chalice loses all of its abilities, which essentially negates the Chalice on 0, which allows you to then cast, more Crashing Footfalls as you go on. Subtlety is a way that you can just deal with some creatures or planeswalker spells, put them on top or bottom of your library. Some pretty good tempo in the fact that a lot of the time, like the Rhinos deck doesn't really like seeing Grist. It doesn't like seeing Teferi Time Raveler or what have you. And also the Cascade mechanic as a whole doesn't want to see Teferi Time Raveler. So Subtlety is like a way to kind of answer those more problematic planeswalkers while being able to keep on the pressure with its Rhinos. And to cap it all off, it gets to play one of the best creatures, period, in the format in Murktide Regent. For those of you that don't know, Murktide is technically a 7-mana 3/3 for 2 blue and 5 color, or 5 generic and 2 blue. I guess that's technically the right term. It has Delve, so you can exile cards from your own graveyard, and it pays for 1 generic of the spell. Has flying, and then it enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it for each instant and sorcery card exiled with it. So if you exile 5 instant sorceries, it's essentially a 2-mana 8/8. To make it super basic, if you exile 3, it ends up being, whatever 6/6. However, if you delve for the full cost, what have you. Does not mean it has to be instant sorcery cards. Obviously, you can delve whatever you want to pay for the cost, just you get more of a benefit for exiling instant sorcery spells. And then whenever an instant sorcery card leaves your graveyard, put a +1/+1 counter on Murktide Regent. This usually comes up like if you're casting like another Murktide Regent, that technically the second Murktide can boost the third or the second one. Or the second one can boost the first one. In most of those scenarios. In this case, it's not really going to come up. Doesn't look like there's a lot of ways to just exile instant sorcery cards from your graveyard, but if your opponent's like interacting with your graveyard in a meaningful way, Murktide Regent can grow from just that kind of interaction. Going further, we said that this deck likes to interact. Tishana and Subtlety is definitely some of the ways it gets to do it, while also getting to put bodies into play. But some of the more traditional ways are like getting to play cards like Dismember, which are essentially 1 mana, -5/-5, kills most of the threats that you can find in Modern. Amulet Titan seeing an uptick, where this card isn't really going to be able to kill a Titan, but it will, severely neuter it. Although, like, they're going to get their value and stuff like that. And, of course, as kind of conditions dictate. But you also have, like, Tishana's Tidebinder and Subtlety to kind of deal with Titans in their own different way. You have Flame of Anor, which kind of synergizes really well with, like, Tishana's Tidebinder. I believe usually these lists are playing Mutavault, which we see 2 lands being played. You choose 1 for 3 mana. And if you control a wizard as you cast the spell, you may choose 2 instead. And target player draws 2 cards, destroy target artifact, deals 5 damage to target creature. All relevant modes to the format. If you just need raw cards, like 3 mana draw 2 at instant speed is fine. If you have like a Mutavault, it ends up being kind of in a way 4 mana, because you can tap the Mutavault to add a mana and then activate itself, and then you can kind of deal with a problematic creature with Yawgmoth seeing an uptick in play, destroying an artifact, and dealing 5 damage to target creature is super good. And then, like I said, just getting to draw 2 cards, not necessarily in the face of like a format that is playing a lot of Bowmaster. And in fact, in the RC, we're going to talk about why Bowmaster was the most played card in the format. And but still, like, you're able to kind of play around it. You're able to kind of do things to get around, getting hurt by a Bowmaster and stuff. But overall, Flame of Anor is just a very powerful card, very interactive, and really lines up pretty well with the format as it stands currently. You have Force and Negation, 4 of them in the main deck for this player. You can, if it's not your turn, you may exile a blue card from your hand rather than pay the spell's mana cost. You counter target non-creature spell. If that spell is countered this way, exile it instead of putting it into its own library, and it costs 3 mana. So this card is obviously very good at interacting with your opponent on their turn. So you can only get the alternate cost of casting this card for free if you play it during their turn. So this is kind of like a way that you can interact with other Crashing Footfalls decks on their turn if they go for like Shardless Agent and they don't drop their phone. Going even further, like if you are trying to protect your hand from like a Thoughtseize, Force Negation as a 2-for-1 feels really bad, but the way that you leverage it is by 2-for-1ing yourself, and the one from them almost feels like 2 cards. And then a lot of times when like you're countering a Thoughtseize, and it usually comes up in like game 1s and stuff, if you're countering a Thoughtseize, it ends up being very good for you because you're protecting more than likely a Cascade spell, something else to kind of interact with. Maybe you're trying to protect like a Murktide Regent because you're just going to end up playing a bunch of spells, and then that's going to be kind of like the threat that you deploy. Whatever the case may be, you still end up putting a huge clock into play, and like the tempo that you gain from countering that spell can kind of offset the 2-for-1 nature of playing like Force Negation and in turn like Subtlety and things like that when you play against like Rakdos Scam. One Mystical Dispute, another card that you can kind of play like in the mirror. Sure, it's fine. Like playing against Murktide Regent, it's going to be at least pretty decent because it's not going to be a 1-mana like counterspell unless you control the pace 3, and this is like something that you can reasonably keep up mana for, especially if you're holding on to like a Violent Outburst or whatever. You can counter something and then untap, and then Violent Outburst / Shardless Agent to kind of go for it. Dead Gone, Fire Ice, good early ways of interacting with the board to go alongside like Dismember. Dead Gone, for a red, you can cast Dead and deal 2 damage to target creature. For 3 mana, you can cast Gone and return target creature you don't control to its owner's hand. Kind of an odd ability for a red spell, but this is a way that you can just kind of deal with some problematic creatures. This is also kind of a way you can get out from under Magus of the Moon, where just getting to deal 2 damage to something is going to kill a lot of the early relevant threats in the format. Fire Ice, icing your opponent to like tap their permanent and draw a card on like the end step, and then getting to go into casting your Cascade spell is pretty nice tempo, especially in a format that some of the decks really like playing counterspell. So if you're able to take them off counterspell and put them more specifically on Spell Pierce, which I think has been kind of dropping a little bit in play in favor of some other spells, you can definitely set yourself in a position to kind of go off and at least resolve 1 Crashing Footfalls and put your opponent on the back foot. Fire also getting to deal 2 damage to something, but can also go 1-1. Pretty good for dealing with like Ragavans early on. And again, just hitting some of those other creatures that might have a bump in toughness. For Lorien Revealed, allows you to play a few less lands. Also a pretty good card to be having late game, where if you can just play it and draw 3 cards, kind of feels like the Murktide package in a way where you can just discard this for island cycling, go get you an island. Obviously hit your 2nd land drop or your 3rd land drop, what have you, and then this also ends up becoming food for the Murktide Regent later. The mana base, you have 1 Boseiju, you have a Otawara here as like your channel lands. The Otawara bounces artifact, creature, enchantment, or planeswalker to its owner's hand. Costs less for each legendary creature. You don't have any legendary creatures. Boseiju getting to destroy an artifact, enchantment, or a non-basic land an opponent controls, and then that player searches library for a card with a basic land type, puts onto the battlefield, and shuffles their library. These are just good ways of like interacting with some of the other threats in the format. Otawara is a way that at instant speed you can interact with a Teferi Time Raveler, which I won't say this deck like necessarily struggles against, but really does not want to see. So Otawara kind of gets to play around the static ability of a Teferi Time Raveler. Boseiju getting to interact with Tron, because you never know when you need to carry a Boseiju around to destroy a tower. Going even further, you have cards like the Chalice of the Void, you have the Engineered Explosives that end up dealing well with Rhinos after they've resolved. So this is like ways that you can interact with them and force them to get no value, or only clear maybe a little bit of the board, and then follow it up with another Crashing Footfalls, what have you. Just some versatility in the mana base where you can afford it to make yourself a little bit more interactive and a little bit better against main deck hate cards. Going even further, you have like your usual fetch lands like Misty Rainforest, you have Wooded Foothills, but you have this Gemstone Caverns in the main deck, and this is kind of another in a way utility land, but not in the way that Beseiju and Otawara are utility lands. There's also the 2 Mutavault in there as well to kind of go with the Flame of a Knower, plus, can add some pressure, on empty boards. Gemstone Cavern says, if it is in your opening hand and you are not the starting player, you may begin the game with a Gemstone Caverns on the battlefield with a luck counter on it. If you do, exile a card from your hand. It adds colorless mana, but if it has a luck counter on it, it adds 1 mana of any color instead. It is a legendary land, so if you have 2 of them in your hand, please do not put both of them into play and then exile 2 cards from your hand, because that's going to end up bad for you, because you're going to end up being with 3 cards in hand and only 1 land in play to show for it. But this deck only plays 1 copy of it, so essentially if you are on the draw, you can virtually put yourself on the play by putting this card into play and then exiling a card from your hand. And also getting to mana fix as well. Playing this, I believe, has a decently low opportunity cost. There is sometimes it comes up, and as we kind of look at the deck list and stuff from the event, on the podcast and stuff, a friend of mine and co-host Randy plays a lot of Rhinos. He can kind of go more in depth than what I can, just because he's been playing the deck for 2 years, and while I understand kind of what's going on, he definitely has a little bit more of the concrete information, I would say, than what I have. So moving on to the sideboard to wrap this up, you have Beseiju in the sideboard. Doesn't hurt to have another copy. You have a Blood Moon, because sometimes you can just win the game with a Blood Moon if your opponent's not able to play around it and you kind of know what's going on. Brotherhood's End to sweep up some of the other creatures, like in the Yawgmoth matchups and things like that, and maybe the other random artifacts that can show up. 3 Endurance. You have Urtai Scorn, which is from I believe this is Brotherhood, or no, this is Dominaria United. Cost a blue less to cast if an opponent controls 2 or more, or cast 2 or more spells this turn, and then you can essentially, for 2 mana, a little less restrictive than a counterspell, you can counter target spell, and it costs 3 mana, so you're never going to cascade into it, regardless of what's going on. You have another Flame of the Knower. You have Magus of the Moon, which is essentially a Blood Moon that you can eventually win the game with. Mystical Dispute is, we mentioned earlier, is 3 mana. 3 mana mana leak, but then has the upside of being able to be a 1 mana leak some amount of time, and a Force of Vigor to destroy those up to 2 artifact and or enchantments. Usually ends up putting in a lot of work when it comes in from the sideboard. And that is the Crashing Footfalls deck for Modern. A little bit more long-winded than I wanted to. I definitely went more in-depth in this deck tech than I had planned on it, but there's definitely a lot of neat and cool interactions and things that have kind of come from this Crashing Footfalls deck, and how much it's kind of innovated from its original, inception. And, of course, getting to add new cards always helps, but realistically, in the grand scheme of things, Footfalls has evolved so much and ends up being more than just a kind of brainless Cascade deck where you're just cascading into something broken and then trying to leverage it that way. You're doing that, but then also getting to play a lot of really good interaction that lines up well with the format. So going forward, I would not be surprised to see Crashing Footfall see an uptick in play, hopefully over Rakdos Scam, because Rakdos Scam, at least in my opinion, didn't have a really good showing compared to this deck and the Yawgmoth deck, which we went over last week. So that's going to do it for me in this video. I hope you all enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like on the video. Comment down below what Modern deck that you would like to see next, as we kind of continue our journey through the top tiers of Modern and kind of over-explaining everything that's going on. If you want to see more videos from me, please consider subscribing, ring the notification bell, so you know when those videos get posted, and checking out my other playlists that I have on the Modern and Pioneer. And be on the lookout for some gameplay later this week for the Crashing Footfalls deck. For real this time, I mean it. I really need to be good about actually showing off the deck and playing it, because I know I learn a lot more playing rather than just explaining. So be on the lookout for that. And of course, check out the Casual Spikes podcast that is going up every Saturday, going forward until I guess we get sick of it or we get canceled, one of the two. That's going to do it for me. Hope you all enjoyed the video, and I will see you all in the next one.